As we know, college football fans are a passionate bunch. We're doing a series here on Mark Rogers TV where we're talking to top bloggers across the country. Of course, they're very passionate. If you're going to write constantly the in-depth analysis about a particular football program, you're pretty passionate. And we're talking to them about the best wins and the worst losses since they've been watching college football. And if they want to dive back into the history books and into the archives before they were fans, hey, that's great too. Whatever the criteria, it's wide open. It doesn't have to be for a conference championship or national championship or anything like that. The criteria is wide open. If it's against a big rival, whatever the criteria, those wins that still make you smile. And we're talking to Shane Roberts of Block U on the SB Nation platform for Utah Utes football. Hey, Shane.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for coming back to talk to us. We've had a good time with this one. So I've got my list here, which isn't going to provide anything close to the knowledge that you have and the perspective on Utah football, but I kind of just drummed through some things and came up with a few games. I'd love to hear your list on Utah's best wins since you've been watching the program.
Sure, and I'm kind of a younger fan. I went to school at the U starting in 2004. Which happened to be Urban Meyer's swan song up at the University of Utah before going to Florida. Really, it's a funny thing is the program really struggled for about 10 to 15 years. Ron McBride, brought a lot of life into the program, but it definitely hit a plateau to where, they had maybe one top 10 ranked team in about 20 years. You could tell he had talent, but he couldn't push him over the edge. And once Urban came in, that really changed. So the first one on my list, and this is definitely not in any particular order, would be kind of a bookend one. The first one would be the 2004 Holy War versus the team down south, BYU. College game day comes to campus. There was Heisman talk about Alex Smith. Which, frankly, he should have been considered much more than I think Matt Weiner. He had an NFL team around him. Alex didn't. They just completely ran the rivals off the field, beat them, I want to say, 52-21, if I remember properly, and just completely destroyed him. And the fun thing about that game is it ticks off a lot of BYU fans because for the longest time, they were the ones that were on the outside looking into the BCS. Everybody thought that they would be the BCS buster. They have Heisman Trophy winners and, a quote-unquote national championship they supposedly won in 1984 against the Michigan team. So that game was very special for a lot of reasons because it really kind of capped off Utah's ascent into everything that they've been building to be, followed by the 2005 Fiesta Bowl. Utah went to that game about 16-point favorites against a completely overmatched Pittsburgh team. It was on ABC, that Brett Musburger, which I swear he was taking a nap halfway through the game just because it turned into the blowout, which everybody kind of expected it to be. But it was very vindicating because a lot of people didn't think Utah could compete with a back then Big Six BCS conference team. And people forget that after that season, the BCS changed their formula. They changed it to where if you're in the top 12, you can get in. Top 14, if you're ahead of a BCS conference champion, you get in. Back then, you had to be top 6 no matter what to be an automatic qualifier. So out of all the quote-unquote BCS busters out there, Utah's 2004 team and Utah's 2008 team both met that criteria. I'm pretty sure TCU's might have, but Boise State's, we kind of consider them kind of BYU-ish. They kind of fell into that same criteria, or I'm sorry, the new scoring system. They got a little bit easier to get into the BCS bowl game than we did. So that was very vindicating for that Fiesta Bowl. Then the next ones shouldn't be a surprise to very many people. That would be almost the entire 2008 season. So I'll start with against Oregon State. Oregon State in 2008, they just came off an upset victory over #1 USC, and the next week they came into Rice-Eccles Stadium. It was the first real true test for us that season. At that point, I want to say we were about 5-0, 6-0, and there was the BCS words were kind of being whispered a little bit, but nobody just wanted to be there, go there yet. Utah was down 11 points with a minute and a half remaining. Actually, no, we were down 10 points with a minute and a half remaining. We go down, we score a touchdown, then we get a 2-point conversion with probably about a minute left. And the great thing about that 2-point conversion is it actually took two attempts. We tried one, and it was an incomplete pass to the back of the end zone, but it got called due to a pass interference. We get the ball back, score the 2-point conversion. For whatever reason, Mike Riley at Oregon State decided to basically almost give Utah the ball back. He kept running out of bounds. I don't know if it was the players or what, but the clock kept stopping. And they had a terrible punt when we got it about the 50-yard line. And then all we had to do was get into Louis Sakota's range, which Louis Sakota is probably arguably the best field goal kicker in Utah football history. And he was just money from 50-plus yards, or about 53 yards. And we finally got the ball down to, got him within probably about a 30, 35-yard field goal, and he knocked it through, and it was improbable. We all thought the perfect season was over at that point because 10 points in a minute and a half, game's over at that point. A couple of weeks later would be my next one, and that would be against TCU. Utah was ranked, I want to say, about 8th at that point. TCU was 10th, so we had 2 top 10 teams in Rice-Eccles Stadium, and that was just a defensive showdown. If you go back and look at those rosters, those were 2 NFL field rosters too. TCU and Utah had. Obviously, TCU had Andy Dalton. We had Paul Kruger. We had Sean Smith, Koamisi. Virtually that entire defense is now in the NFL. It was a 13-10 final score. Utah hadn't scored a touchdown, or they really haven't scored at all since the first quarter. So they get the ball back. Actually, TCU goes down to kick a field goal to put them up 13-6, I think is what the score would have been at that point. Field goal, the kicker misses it. So obviously we get the ball back. Quick 3-and-out, just like the rest of the night. Louis Sakote does one of the worst punts in his entire career, probably only about a 15, 20-yard punt. TCU took over at the 50. They drove it down for another field goal. Kicker misses it again. And at that point, you kind of feel like, okay, something's magical is going on in the stadium. Brian Johnson leads that team down the field for the game-winning touchdown to take Utah to 10-0 in the season, and they beat just a great TCU team. I've never heard a louder stadium than Rice-Eccles Stadium that night. Rice-Eccles doesn't get a ton of credit out there because it only holds about 45,000 people, but it's loud and it's pretty intimidating. Those were 2 of the best regular season ones, and then obviously the 2009 All-State Sugar Bowl against Alabama. And Utah just took Alabama to the woodshed that night. Nick Saban had no answers. Brian Johnson just ripped that secondary to shreds. Julio Jones was in that game. He didn't do anything. Sean Smith had him on lockdown all night long. A lot of people think it was because Alabama overlooked Utah, and there's probably some truth to that, maybe a little bit. But again, that Utah team was loaded with NFL talent. If you cannot get hyped up for a BCS game, then I don't know what your problem is, especially in the Sugar Dome, which I was in that night. Not the Sugar Dome, the Superdome, excuse me. We were outnumbered 5-1, but that place was silent. I've never been so happy to never hear Roll Tide ever again. And that was the last time before this last year that they've lost a bowl game, I believe, before this last season. So we took Alabama to the whooping shed that night, and it was magical in every sense of the word. It was fantastic, and we still maintain to this day that Utah team was the best team in the country that year. The only undefeated team. Obviously, Florida and Urban Meyer would have different things to say about that, but that Utah team was definitely special. And an interesting side note is that it was the last season that Utah had a quarterback start and end a season healthy. Was that 2008 perfect season? So there was that one. A lot of really good wins mixed in between. Next one is probably one that might surprise some people, and that would be the Sun Bowl in 2011, if I remember the year right, against Georgia Tech. Utah was down 14 in that game in the fourth quarter. And when you get down 2 touchdowns against an option team, they'll just bleed you to death. and Lotulele just kept stuffing them. We got the ball back, completed a fourth and about 13. It was a fourth and goal, but it was about from the about 13, 15-yard line for a touchdown to tie the game. Went to overtime, and then John White just ran it down their throats for a game-winning touchdown. That was, I want to say, our 9th or 10th consecutive bowl victory, but it looked like it was all but over at that point in terms of getting back on the bowl win streak. And then this last season, the win against Stanford up at Rice-Eccles Stadium against the number 5 ranked team in the country. As you mentioned earlier, a lot of people still say it was an anomaly. I disagree. Obviously, I'm probably looking through my crimson shaded glasses, but Utah dominated that game for about 3.5 quarters. Stanford was down 2 scores almost the entire game. Offensively, Utah was moving the ball at will. Defensively, Stanford, outside their opening drive, couldn't do anything. And that kind of gave a preview of what Utah football can do in a conference such as the Pac-12 when they're completely healthy. A lot of people forget that, as I mentioned previously, that there's a lot of Mountain West Conference recruits on this team. And once the Pac-12 level guys went down, then you're kind of shorthanded, and that's what happened after Stanford. But that game was fantastic. Stanford had a chance to basically win the game there on the goal line at the end of the game, but goal line stand. Utah lost a lot of those games earlier on that season with Oregon State, with UCLA. I mean, it was just kind of, oh my God, this is going to happen again. But of course, they held against Stanford. And the funny thing is, if you notice 2 things about 2 of those games with Stanford and Alabama, if there's a pro set style team out there, I'm not scared of them one bit, no matter how good they are, because Kyle Whittingham can shut those kind of teams down. If you're going to line up and try to play smash mouth football with them, it's not going to go very well for you, because Utah has the big Polynesian defensive lineman. Obviously, we've talked about the skill in the secondary that Utah's had in a long time with all the NFL draft picks. So the Stanford game definitely tops off probably the most exhilarating wins. There's many more out there, but those ones are top of mind, are just some of those ones that you look back on and you'll always enjoy and cherish.
Shane, I can't add anything to that. As you might imagine, the 2 BCS wins I had listed here, the Stanford game from last year. The only other game I went to, I know that there was a USC Freedom Bowl that was lost around 1991, but then there was one that was won against, I believe, Pete Carroll's first team at USC in 2001, like a 10-6 game. And
No, those are great ones. Good ones, especially the Vegas Bowl against Pete Carroll's SC before they really went on their tear. They had Carson Palmer at the quarterback. Utah, if I remember right in that game, had Mike Anderson. He just ran over those guys like crazy. But I was a little bit young for those ones. I don't remember those ones very well. So that's all archive footage. There's one where Utah beat Minnesota in the Dome back in the 90s, and Ron McBride ran down the field when they won and jumped and dogpiled with the rest of the team. There's 20, 21-year-olds in shoulder pads and helmets, and there's this 50-plus-year-old man just dogpiling with him just because that's how Coach Mack did and does things. So that's another one. Any of the rivalry games with BYU over the last 3 to 4 seasons, all of those except one have come down to the final play. But I don't like to give them any credit. So.
Yeah, you bring up the Minnesota game, and I vaguely remember that, but I do recall that situation, and especially back then, not so much now. It wouldn't even be a blip on the radar, but there was obviously much cachet given to the Big Ten and a lot of other large conferences, and even though maybe the talent was very even, I'm sure it was, Minnesota being a mid-tier, if that, Big Ten team at the time. Yeah, it was a big deal if you beat a Big Ten team if you were coming from what was considered a lesser conference. The thing that I would like to bring up really quick before we let you go is you bring up the BCS aspect of this, which I have been a detractor of the BCS, to be polite. I just thought it was a farce, and everyone pointed to the issue with Auburn being left out of the 2004 national championship game. But here sits an undefeated Utah team, and you can go on about schedules and all that other business. But if you're playing FBS football, or what was formerly known as Division I football, and you go undefeated, then you're doing everything you could possibly do that was asked of you in regards to that schedule, and not to be given a shot, I think is just a crime. Again, you beat up on an undermanned Pitt team that has absolutely no game, I believe 35-7, and I just wanted to see that Utah team play one of the better teams in the country in a BCS game. Then you fast forward again to that Alabama situation, and I hate to see games like that kind of discarded as, well, Alabama didn't show up, they didn't care.
No, Utah was the better team.
Yeah, Utah was the better football team, really had a two-score lead most of the night in that game, and we can't go into the psyche of athletes or teams. We could talk about that every game. The game's on the schedule. The game is a major bowl game, and even if it wasn't a major bowl game, it's there. It's a competitive situation. You need to show up and play. We don't know if that was a factor or not. The bottom line is that Utah was a much better football team on that night than an Alabama team that almost played in the national championship game if they would have won the SEC title game against Florida. So that was an Alabama football team that very much ran through a very difficult schedule to get to that point. So credit Utah on those two specific occasions there.
Well, the funny thing that you bring up with the 04 team is a lot of people forget that they were the third undefeated. Everybody talks about USC and Auburn. Everybody kind of conveniently forgets about the Utes that year. And I still maintain that they would have beat Auburn. USC now, that was one of the most incredible teams ever assembled, or bought, maybe. Either way, that Utah team, I think a lot of people don't realize how much talent was on that team with Alex Smith leading that offense. That was kind of the first time that the spread offense, outside of maybe what Oregon was doing at the time, really hit prime time. Urban brought that really to the forefront, and nobody had an answer for it. And I believe that they were definitely at least the second best team. I'd have loved to see them play SC, no doubt about it. Now that would have been tough, but I just don't like to give credit to SEC teams either, I guess, either. But either way, that was a very special team, no doubt about it.
Yeah, so you had SEC, Oklahoma, and of course Auburn in the mix, along with Utah, and that SEC team was just ridiculous. And you could look at that NFL roster that Oklahoma had, and they couldn't stay within 5 touchdowns of USC. One quick thing to ask you, Shane, before we let you go on the best wins ever: do you see a rival emerging in the Pac-12 for this football program?
Oh, the Pac-12 is really trying to push Colorado, just because of the regional. We came in together. For some reason, they play us really, really tough. They actually beat us a couple years ago, and I'll get back to that in another one of our videos. But every game virtually has been extremely competitive that Utah's been in the Pac-12. Really, outside of maybe ASU a couple years ago, where they wiped a floor with us. The Utah and Oregon State have a really interesting thing going back and forth. I don't want to say it's heated, but the games have always been just fantastic. Utah and UCLA, same thing. Nobody's really kind of stepped up yet. Obviously, everybody wants to be rivals with USC, but obviously they only really have UCLA and Notre Dame and those guys. But Utah and USC games have been very, very entertaining. Nobody's taken that cheap shot yet. Nobody's talked trash yet. Nobody's done that yet. There's been a lot of respect back and forth. It'll be interesting, especially now with Steve Sarkisian taking over USC, which Sark is a former BYU quarterback, kind of see where he goes. We're still kind of waiting for that one primary rival to kind of pop out. Right now, just by default, maybe it's Colorado, but even then, that's a stretch at best.
Yeah, if you look at the situation in the Pac-12, it's very nice and neat when it was the Pac-10, and rivalries, as we both know, they emerge for different reasons. And again, in the Pac-10, they're paired off very neatly: Washington State, Oregon State, the two Northern California schools, then USC, UCLA, then Arizona State. So it's right there, and it's paired off. And then you got Colorado and Utah, and as you mentioned, the geography makes sense for those two teams to match up, but you can't force a rivalry. They found that out with Iowa and Nebraska and other situations around college football. Shane Roberts writes for the Block U on the SB Nation platform. We appreciate, again, the insight and the information, and it's always fun to look back on some college football history and what has really fueled some great wins in the past, and the fan base, ignited the fan base, and Utah certainly has a very storied recent past with some really good football talent. So Shane, we'll have you back, and unfortunately we got to talk the negative side of this and those excruciating losses.
Yep, there's some of those.